Okay, Evo, I understand what you're saying. Luck might have a little part of it, but after getting 20 critical hits in a row, someone's dice game becomes a little suspect. We gotta put an end to it, and I think the best way to do it is to create some kind of contraption. And I think I have just the idea. Oh, hey everyone, and welcome to Groove Builders, the show where we create together. I'm your host, Disorderly Cone, and this is my cheating friend, Evo. It's true. Let me put you down real quickly. In this episode, we're going to be taking an idea in an image, turning it into a 3D model, and then throwing it on our 3D printer to see if it actually works. If this process interests you, I think you might like this video. When I was a young time traveler, I played a lot of video games, and one of my favorite consoles was the Game Boy handheld. I played a ton of Super Mario Brothers on there. And you know, after playing it for a little while, you get some questions that you have to ask yourself, like how many Marios were eaten by those fish? Yeah, those things were pretty pesky, weren't they? And you know, when you think about it, those little fish called Cheep Cheeps are pretty cool. They have a little spherical shape, they got a big mouth, and if we're creating a dice tower, that might be the perfect thing to remember this game by. Yeah, you know what? I think a cheap dice tower would be perfect. And there's actually already a ton of dice towers on the market that we can take a quick little look at to get an idea about how we could design this whole thing. So first off, let's take a look at those dice towers. There's a ton out on the market. We got staircases here, which look like the dice just kind of fall down in a spiral pattern. We have some that have trap doors. We also have others where they kind of put on top and fall down this little slot here. And as you can see, there's tons of different designs. Basically, what we need to have happen is we need to have our dice tumble at certain points, allowing for this to kind of come out randomly at a number. And with these dice here, I think we can achieve that pretty easily. Looking at a picture of Cheep Cheep, we can take a quick look to see what kind of shapes we're dealing with. Right away, we can see that we have a big cylindrical body here. We also have a really big fin, probably on both sides. Of course, we don't have a one-finned Cheep Cheep. And then also, we have a nice big tail with a mohawk on top and big lips. These lips are actually pretty good for where our dice can come out. And if we, I guess, make a hole on the top of our mohawk, we should be able to put the dice on top and allow it to tumble down a little bit and come out the mouth and onto the table. This should work. So now we need to take this idea and put it into our 3D modeling program. Let's do that. There we go, inside of our 3D modeling program, Nomad Sculpt. I know this looks a little bit intimidating, especially with all the tools and grids and stuff. Don't worry though, it's actually a lot easier to use than you might think. And it's always a good time when we kind of run into these programs that we've never used before to take chances, make mistakes, and get messy, like my teacher used to say. Now, again, I really want to stress this. It's a lot easier to use than you might think, especially if you've used Photoshop or any kind of editing software in the past. These tools are quite similar, just with a little bit of a 3D aspect. Let's dive a little bit into this, and so I can show you how I started my Cheep Cheep, and maybe you can create something at home similar or even better than I created here. The first thing you'll notice with a little ball of clay here is that it sits on an X, Y, and Z axis. And right now with that little mirror there, everything that we do on this X, Y, and Z axis will be mirrored. What I mean by that is if I put a little dot of clay here, we can see that I have my little clay tool attached. If I add a little bit of clay, you'll see that it mirrors itself on either side on equal parts. Pretty cool thing if you ask me. Now, oops, we're gonna go back here. And the first thing we need to do when it comes to creating anything is get a really nice reference image. So we're gonna go into our images here and we're gonna pull up our little Cheep Cheep. There we go. Okay, now we can take this image and we can actually move it down for a better frame reference, but for right now, this is okay for us. But I'm just trying to get you an idea about how I built this. We're actually not building it all the way through. Now, when it comes to adding things on here, we have a whole bunch of tools that we can actually use. The clay tool adds clay to our clay ball. We can also take away clay by pressing this little teardrop over here where it says sub. Now, what we do is just add a little bit. If we're doing our eyes, we're just going to make some circles here, and we're going to work a little bit on the front. Now, it's important to rotate this because then we can add things at different angles. It might not look exactly what you want, right away, but you can work on it, and I'll show you how we can get some really cool effects. Now again, I'm just kind of adding this on here, doing circles. I really like the Apple Pen for this because the Apple Pen allows me to use that pressure sensitivity, and the harder I press here, the more clay I'm actually getting, which is pretty cool. We don't want to smile on our Cheep Cheep just yet, but as you can see, we're working on these eyes pretty well. And again, we're not going to build the entire thing here, we're just going to get an idea. I want to make sure that these gaps are kind of filled in, but again, we're going to get a really nice oval shape here in just a few moments. This is just a really messy look here. And again, bring us down maybe a little bit more, fill it out. Okay, so now we got a little bit of our eyes. Now they do kind of converge here, so we're going to do a little bit of convergence. And now what we're going to do, because we have all these kind of sharp little triangle things here, we're actually going to smooth it out a little bit. By going over to the smooth button, we can then kind of make everything look kind of nice and get an idea of what we have to work with. And again, as you smooth things, it equals out on both sides. So what you do in the center here is going to happen equally again on both sides. If you do a little bit on the right here, you can get a more of a reference to see what's going on. If you don't like how you kind of got this little connection here, you can keep rubbing that away. You can also increase the intensity on the left-hand side here. We can go up and down. You can see that that goes up. The radius, of course, increases the amount and how big you can do this. So let's just do this right here. You can see it's a little bit bigger. The intensity, of course, allows how much the brush is actually putting out. So again, big things, we don't really want to do that. We go smaller, we can see more of an effect, okay? Now again, this is all smoothing. Smoothing is not what we want to do. If you want to see more of a better effect here, we can use the clay brush. You can see the clay adds a lot more, a lot quicker. We increase the radius here, and you can see, oh my goodness, we got a giant growth of our Cheep Cheep. Not cool. But you can get the idea of here how we can create some really cool stuff. The other thing I want to show you is the creases here. The cool thing about the crease tool is it actually gives us some definition that we can work with, which allows us to get some really interesting shapes, especially when it comes to the mouth of our Cheep Cheep. Now that I've kind of demonstrated how this program actually works, let's jump into the part where I actually have everything designed, and I'll walk you through my design itself. Okay, there we go. We have our fully modeled Cheep Cheep here, just sitting above our plane. Now this is all finished. I did my best here, guys. This is my first model I've ever done, and it took a little bit of time to get everything the way I liked it, but I just added clay, took it away, made some creases, and I really do like how everything looks here. I think he has some really cool definition. The mouth here was actually really easy to form. All I did was just kind of add a whole bunch of clay and then hollow out the center and smoothed out the lips there to get a really nice look. And I think I achieved exactly what I wanted. This program is a ton of fun to play with, and I can't wait to do more with this and maybe actually do a full tutorial showing you how to create some cool stuff at home. But I think I've given you guys some good ideas here right now about what you can do with this program, and I'm interested to see what kind of things you can actually come up with. Okay, now that we got our Cheep Cheep, we need to export this as an STL file, which will make this an actual 3D little thing that we can work with, if you will. And then we'll take this and throw it into Tinkercad. I realized that I could probably use this program to design the entire thing, but again, I'm just not skilled with this guy yet, and I don't feel comfortable trying to figure that out. So we're gonna jump over to Tinkercad. There we go. And in Tinkercad, you can see that I've done a few things already here. The first thing I did was add a star for our Cheep Cheep to sit on. And this is because I wanted some stability for when we actually put dice in it. The second thing that I did was put a mechanism on the inside. Now, what I did with this mechanism, let me see if I can actually show you what I've done here. Okay, there we go. You can see the insides here. Now, what I've done is I've taken a little area out of the top of the mohawk and kind of made a shaft. In the shaft, I put some triangles. I didn't put any kind of shelf because if I did that, it would need supports on the inside. And I didn't want to have any supports through the entire inside of our Cheep Cheep. So instead, I made some really easy triangles on some good angles, which should allow for 0 supports on the inside. Should. Now, the next thing that I did was allow for the bottom half to have some fall so they could fall out of the Cheep Cheep's mouth. The last thing that I did was make sure there was a little tiny lip at the very bottom, which allowed for the dice to kind of have a last little tumble as they fall out of Cheep Cheep's mouth. This should allow for the dice to roll as easy as possible through Cheep Cheep. With everything the way it is here, it should work pretty flawlessly. The only other thing I want to point out is how big our Cheep Cheep is. And the reason for that is because when I pull out a reference dice in Tinkercad, I get these little two red guys over here. Let me just take that guy there. And they're quite big. If you are using this as a reference for an actual D20, I'm telling you right now, it's too big. It's way too big. It's about half the size of this. So this Cheep Cheep is massive. At least it's going to be massive when we print it out. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this design, and I think it should work pretty well with the dice. Let's export this as an STL and throw it into our printer and see what happens. And boom, there we have it. Our Cheep Cheep all complete. And doesn't it look awesome in this two-tone silk PLA from everyone? I think it does. I was actually curious if I was going to paint it or not, but given it has this really cool effect on it, I think I'm going to leave it the way it is. The only negative thing I have to say about this PLA is it kind of highlights some of the problems you might have with your printer, especially if you have some layer shifting or some wobbling going on. You can see with mine here on the purple side, there's some lines going up there that look a little bit green. And that's because I actually haven't tuned my printer yet. I'm looking to just test this one right out of the box, and I've done 2 projects with it so far, and I'm pretty happy with it. Review coming soon. But overall, I'm really happy with the way this printed out. But before we get to testing it, let's talk about the Cura profile. When it comes to my slicer profile, I used Cura and the standard profile for the Ender 3 Max Neo. And again, I'm still testing this and I haven't really ironed out all the kinks, but overall I think it printed pretty well. The thing I want to touch on though is the supports. You only need supports right here under the lip and under the wing to be able to get Cheep Cheep to print. Cura's going to recommend a whole lot of weird supports, especially if you use trees. Don't do that. Don't waste your time. Don't waste your materials. Just make sure you have enough support right here and underneath the lip, and you should be pretty good to go. All right, now let's see if this thing actually works and test it out. All right, Cheep Cheep, ready to go. Dice in hand. And of course, our cheating friend looking on in envy. Now, let's put our first 6-sided dice through to see what happens. Ah, perfect. See that, buddy? It works. The second one here is our D20. Let's see how that goes. Woo! Right off the table. That is perfect. Now let's see if we can get these other ones to go through all at once. Great! And look, that one even hits you. Well, our Cheep Cheep looks to do exactly what it was designed to do, which is act as a dice tower. But as you can see again, you really don't need it this size. D20 dice, that's the hole. We can shrink this guy down about 50% and get the same result, which again, I'll include online. And with that, we're at the end of our episode. I had a really good time coming up with the idea for Cheep Cheep, turning it into a 3D design, and then printing it out with you. And if you guys had a good time, don't forget to press that like button. For more videos like this, hit subscribe as well, as we've got all kinds of really cool content coming on in the future, and I would love to have you there. Until next time, keep building. All right, Evo, it's time to play Dungeons & Dragons, and this time, I think things are going to go a little differently.